camera opens on a quiet, dimly lit dinner table with a single candle flickering, casting shadows. The protagonist, Mary, is sitting alone at the table, her eyes fixed on the flickering light. The music is slow and melancholic. Narrator Mary. It's funny how life can take a turn so quickly. 1 minute you're celebrating another year of life, hoping for nothing more than peace and quiet. And the next you're blindsided by a betrayal so deep it shakes you to your core. Cut to images of a vibrant dinner setting. Mary's son Daniel stands up raising a glass, while his wife Ashley sits at the table smiling with a subtle but practiced expression. Narrator Mary. That was the night I realized just how far some people would go. All I wanted was a quiet dinner with my son, his wife, and a few friends. I didn't ask for drama, but the universe had other plans. The evening had started like any other birthday celebration. The sun had set, casting a soft glow over the city, as I walked into the restaurant, a place Daniel and Ashley had chosen. The warm, ambient light of Edison bulbs hung overhead, and the exposed brick walls gave the place a trendy, modern vibe. It was the kind of place that felt a little too polished for my taste, but I smiled, happy to be in the company of my son, his wife, and a few friends. I'd always been one for simple pleasures, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening of conversation, good food, and perhaps a toast to mark another year of surviving life's ups and downs. Ashley was already there, sitting at the table with her characteristic enthusiasm. She handed me a gift bag, the tissue paper fluffed out in a perfect, exaggerated puff like some kind of over-the-top greeting. The moment she passed it to me, I felt something shift in the air. It was subtle at first, just a strange energy like everyone was waiting for something, but I couldn't place it. Inside the bag was a onesie, one of those baby onesies you get for first-time grandmothers, printed with the words, "Best Grandma Ever." I blinked in surprise, holding the little garment in my hands as if it were made of glass. The fabric was soft, innocent. But the message behind it, that felt anything but innocent. Ashley was looking at me with wide, almost exaggerated eyes. "We thought it was time," she said, her voice practically dripping with sweetness. "Time to start planning the nursery, don't you think?" She smiled, but the smile felt calculated. "Right, Daniel." I turned to my son, who smiled back at me, his expression too composed, almost rehearsed. "Yeah, especially since we'll have more space soon." My heart stopped. More space? My mind raced. More space. I tried to grasp what they were implying, but the words wouldn't fit together. What did they mean, and why did it feel like I'd missed something important? Before I could ask, Ashley leaned in, her voice suddenly more conspiratorial. "We're just so grateful, Mary. Honestly, not every mom would be this generous. Thank you so much for agreeing." I frowned, my heart racing. Grateful, generous. My stomach sank as the weight of her words hit me like a ton of bricks. What had I agreed to? I couldn't remember any conversation where we discussed me giving them my apartment. What on earth was she talking about? Then Daniel stood up. He tapped his wine glass with a spoon, the sound reverberating through the room, catching everyone's attention. I felt the blood rush from my face, my body frozen in place. My mind wasn't processing the words coming from his mouth. It was like he was speaking a language I didn't understand, and yet somehow it felt all too familiar, like an unspoken script I had unknowingly agreed to. "Can I have everyone's attention for a second?" His voice was louder than it needed to be, almost theatrical, like he was preparing for a performance. "Tonight's not just about celebrating my incredible mom's birthday," he continued, his words hanging in the air. "It's also about a big change for our family." Change. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath growing shallow. The room had gone still, the noise of clinking glasses and murmured conversations falling away as everyone focused on him. Ashley was already reaching for her phone camera, poised, her lips curling into that practiced artificial smile. I felt the chill of dread wash over me. The unease in the room was palpable. I could see it in the way everyone was looking at me, expecting something, waiting for my response. "We're moving into Mom's apartment," Daniel announced, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. "It just makes sense," he continued, his voice too calm, too rehearsed. "She doesn't need all that space anymore, and we're starting a family. It's such a gift, honestly. So generous of her. Generous of me." My head spun as the words sank in. My apartment. The place where my husband and I had spent 30 years together, where we had built our life, where I'd lost him. This wasn't just a piece of property. It was everything. It was memories. It was my sanctuary, my safety, My home. And now, without even asking me, they were taking it from me. I sat there in stunned silence, feeling like a stranger in my own life. I didn't know how to react, how to process what was happening. My fork hung limply in my hand, a vague sense of nausea creeping up my throat. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. The conversation around me resumed, but I couldn't hear it. All I could focus on was the crushing weight of what Daniel had just done. Ashley started talking animatedly about how she would redecorate, talking about paint swatches and where the crib would go, as if she had every right to change everything about my home. "Of course we'll let you visit," she said casually, as if that would make it all better. "You can still keep your plants on the balcony if you want." "No, no, no!" My mind screamed in protest. I hadn't agreed to this. I hadn't given them permission. But I was too stunned, too caught in the moment to say anything. Instead, I smiled weakly, a hollow expression that barely masked the shock and hurt I was feeling. In that moment, I realized something deep and painful my son had already decided. He had already made the decision for me. My thoughts felt jumbled, like a fog had settled in my mind. I was being erased. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was just a means to an end, a stepping stone for him and Ashley to reach their next phase in life. I excused myself halfway through dessert, unable to swallow another bite. Daniel gave me a look as if I was overreacting, but I just muttered that I wasn't feeling well. I walked out, the weight of the evening pressing down on me with every step. And as I walked home alone, my mind raced the betrayal, cutting deeper than any words could express. By the time I reached my apartment, everything felt different. The familiar creaks of the door, the warmth of the walls, even the pictures on the bookshelf, they all felt like strangers. It was as if the space had already been claimed by them, even though I was still there. The quiet hum of my life had been shattered, and I didn't know how to pick up the pieces. I locked the door behind me, checking it again and then again. I couldn't stop the thoughts from spiraling. How had it come to this? How had they taken so much from me without me even knowing? The moment Daniel stood up, I felt the atmosphere change in the room, as if the air itself thickened, pressing down on me with a weight I couldn't escape. He raised his glass a little too deliberately, tapping it with his spoon to get everyone's attention. The clinking sound rang out sharper than it needed to be. I felt a sense of dread settle in the pit of my stomach, as if something was about to happen, but I couldn't yet understand what it was. Everyone turned to look at him. His smile was wide, his posture confident, and there was something in his eyes that made my heart race. Something that didn't sit right, even though he was speaking with calm certainty, as if this was a moment that needed to be acknowledged. But I had no idea what was coming. At that point, all I wanted was for the night to remain as it was supposed to be: quiet, celebratory, simple. "Can I have everyone's attention for a second?" Daniel's voice cut through the chatter, louder than necessary, a little too commanding. My heart started to pound in my chest, the soft clink of glassware suddenly drowned out by the beat of my own pulse. "Tonight's not just about celebrating my incredible mom's birthday." He continued, his voice now almost too rehearsed, too smooth. I could feel the weight of his words, but they didn't quite make sense. There was something off in the way he said them, as if he was leading into something bigger, something that wasn't about me at all. Ashley sat beside him, her face framed with that perfectly cultivated smile of hers, her phone already in her hand, ready to record. Her eyes flicked to me for just a moment, but there was no warmth in them. It was as though she was simply checking off a list in her head, making sure everything was falling into place. She was waiting for something, and I had a sinking feeling that I was part of whatever it was. "And we're not just celebrating the past year," Daniel went on, ignoring the sudden tension in the air. "We're also celebrating a big change for our family." The words seemed to hang in the air between us, heavy with an unspoken expectation. My throat tightened, and I glanced around the table, trying to gauge if anyone else could sense it too. But everyone else was looking at him, nodding in agreement, like they already knew what he was going to say. My son, standing tall at the head of the table, beamed as if this was the culmination of some well-planned speech. But it wasn't a speech I had prepared for. It wasn't a speech that felt like it belonged to this moment. Something felt wrong. "We're moving into Mom's apartment," he declared, his voice ringing out almost too matter-of-fact. "It just makes sense," he added quickly, as if his decision was obvious to everyone, and any question would only be a minor inconvenience. "She doesn't need all that space anymore. And we're starting a family." He smiled again, a smile that seemed a little too forced, as if he was trying to convince not just me, but everyone in the room. It's such a gift, honestly. So generous of her. The words stung, and for a moment I thought I might choke. I tried to make sense of what he had just said, but the shock left me frozen. I glanced at Ashley, who was now smiling so widely it almost looked like she was trying to hold back a laugh. Her phone was recording, capturing this moment as if it was some sort of victory. She wasn't just in on it. She was the architect of it, and she had no qualms about letting everyone know. My heart skipped a beat, and I forced myself to breathe, though it felt like I was suffocating. My mind reeled, trying to process what was happening. They were planning to take my home. The home my husband and I had shared for over 30 years, the home where we'd built our life together, where I had mourned his passing, and where I had learned how to live again without him. This wasn't just an apartment, it was the last piece of him I had left. I sat there stunned, my mind struggling to wrap itself around the reality of what Daniel was saying. I had no idea how to respond. No idea what to say. I didn't even know if I had the strength to ask the questions that were burning in my throat. Why? How could you? When did this happen? But the words wouldn't come. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my reaction. Their faces filled with false politeness, with that same rehearsed smile Daniel had on his face. I didn't know if I was the one being cruelly manipulated, or if I was the one who was blind to everything happening around me. He looked at me, then his smile too wide, too eager. Right, Mom. The question was so pointed, like a trap set to catch me in a lie if I didn't play along. I panicked. My mind froze. I nodded not because I agreed, but because I didn't know what else to do. I had to give them some answer that would make the moment move forward, even though I was desperate to make it stop. I took a sip of my wine, letting the cold liquid settle in my throat as I tried to push down the panic rising in me. I wanted to scream, to stand up and walk out, to demand that they take back every word. But instead, I forced a smile that felt like it was made of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. And for the rest of the evening, I sat there numb as they continued to talk about the apartment. Ashley discussed plans to redecorate, to take down curtains I had hung, to paint over the walls I had picked out, as if she were already in charge. Of course, we'll let you visit, she said, as if that would somehow make everything okay. You can still keep your plants on the balcony if you want. My heart shattered a little more with each word. This wasn't about me. This wasn't about family. This wasn't even about love. This was a transaction, a way for them to claim what they believed they had a right to. And I had just been a passive observer in my own life, letting it happen without protest. I excused myself halfway through dessert, telling them I wasn't feeling well. Daniel gave me a look as if I were being dramatic, but I didn't care. I had to leave. I needed space, I needed air, I needed to get away from them before I did something I would regret. As I walked out of that restaurant, the cold night air bit at my skin, but it wasn't enough to clear my head. It wasn't enough to stop the thoughts from racing. I felt like I had been pushed into a corner, trapped in a life I no longer recognized, forced to watch as everything I had worked for slipped away. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me, checked it again and again. But no matter how many times I turned the key, the apartment didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like their home, a place I had no right to anymore. And in that moment, I knew everything had changed. They had taken it from me. Without asking, without warning, they had taken everything. And I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I didn't recognize. The walk home felt like it took forever. The night air was cold, the kind that bites at your skin and makes you feel more alive than you really want to be in moments like this. My heels clicked against the pavement in a rhythm that matched the chaos in my mind, clack, clack, clack. Each step a drumbeat, echoing my disbelief. I couldn't even remember how I had ended up walking 3 blocks. My mind was a fog, and every step felt like I was trudging through it, trying to reach some kind of clarity, but it never came. I tried to focus on something, anything to ground myself. But the moment I thought about the dinner, about Daniel's words, the weight of them crashed down on me again. "We're moving into Mom's apartment," he'd said. The sentence rang in my ears over and over, until it became a dull hum, a reminder of the reality I couldn't escape. That place, that apartment, had always been mine. The place my husband and I had built together, the place I had mourned him, healed from losing him, the place where I had found solitude and comfort when the world became too loud. And now it was no longer mine. It had been claimed without my consent, without a conversation. It was like a cruel joke, except I was the punchline, and it wasn't funny at all. By the time I reached the door to my apartment, I felt hollow. The familiar creak of the old door, the soft groan of the wooden floors. Everything that had once brought me comfort now felt alien. I had always thought of my apartment as a sanctuary, a safe space where I could be myself, where I could remember my husband without feeling like the weight of the world was on me. But tonight it felt like I had been evicted from my own life. I locked the door behind me, and then almost instinctively I checked it again and again, as though somehow I could lock out the reality that was creeping in the overwhelming sense that something precious was being ripped away from me. But no matter how many times I turned the key, the door didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. It was like I was trying to hold on to a piece of my past that had already been taken from me. I stood there in the silence, my hands resting flat against the table, my breath shallow and ragged. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. It was as though the walls were closing in on me, the familiar sounds of my home now sounding foreign and threatening. I looked around at the photos on the bookshelf, at the small mementos that reminded me of my late husband. His laugh, his touch, his presence, all things that had once filled this space with warmth. But now they felt like nothing more than reminders of what was being stolen from me, of what had already been erased. I hadn't realized how much I had taken for granted until that moment, the peace of being in a space that was mine, the freedom of making my own decisions, the simple joy of walking into a room and knowing that I didn't have to share it with anyone unless I chose to. And now that had all been taken from me. It wasn't just the apartment. It was the very essence of my life, my autonomy, my sense of self. It was being overshadowed by people who just a few hours ago I had thought I could trust. As I stood there trying to steady my breath, my gaze landed on a drawer I hadn't touched in months. It was the drawer where I kept my husband's legal documents, the ones I had gone through after his funeral, the ones that now seemed like some distant relic from a time I could barely remember. I pulled it open without thinking, my fingers brushing against the old papers, feeling the coolness of the edges against my skin. As I rifled through them, I found something I hadn't seen in years, a power of attorney form. My stomach dropped. It was signed during a time when I was in the hospital struggling with pneumonia, too weak to argue, too foggy to see what was really happening. There it was, Daniel's name boldly written on the page. He had power over my decisions, over my life, and I hadn't even realized it until now. The realization hit me like a cold slap to the face. It was like everything had been set in motion without me even knowing, without me ever being asked, and I had let it happen. I texted my lawyer that night, my fingers shaking as I typed out the message. Is this still valid? I knew what I had to do, but I wasn't sure how much time I had left to act. By morning, my lawyer had responded, confirming that the power of attorney was indeed still in effect. If I didn't do something soon, Daniel could make decisions on my behalf, financial, legal, medical. Everything I had worked to keep in my own hands, everything I had fought for, could be taken from me in an instant. The weight of the situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I wasn't just facing the betrayal of my son and his wife. I was facing the realization that I had been set up for this, that they had planned it all along. They had been working behind my back, manipulating me with their sweet smiles and empty promises. I hadn't seen it. I hadn't wanted to see it. But now it was too late to ignore. I sank into the chair at my kitchen table, my hands trembling as I tried to process the enormity of what was happening. I felt like I had been living in a fog, letting them pull the strings while I had been too afraid to confront the truth. But now there was no escaping it. I had to fight back. I had to take control of my life again, or I would lose everything. I stood up slowly, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. I knew that this wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about regaining my voice, my autonomy, my dignity. It was about standing up for myself, even if it meant going against the people I had loved and trusted. I couldn't let them win. I wouldn't. I had to act. And I would. The silence of the apartment enveloped me again, but this time, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the beginning of something new, a chance to reclaim what had been taken from me and to fight for the life that was still mine to live. The realization of how deep the betrayal had gone settled in slowly, like the rise of a tide that I could no longer ignore. The power of attorney, that document I had signed years ago, was not just a simple piece of paper. It was a key to my life handed over to Daniel without a second thought. It was a moment of weakness, a time when I was recovering from an illness too disoriented to fully grasp the consequences of what I was signing. And now here I was, faced with the harsh truth that my son had the legal power to make decisions for me, decisions about my finances, my health, my future. He had been given that authority, and I had never revoked it. I sat at my kitchen table in a kind of stunned silence, feeling the weight of the paper in my hands like a chain heavy and cold. It was hard to breathe. The air in the apartment, which had always felt like home, suddenly felt thin and suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears pounding louder with each passing second as the enormity of the situation sank in. Daniel had control over my life, and I hadn't even seen it coming. I thought about the dinner, about the way he had stood up and announced his intentions without so much as a glance in my direction for approval. His voice had been calm, confident, rehearsed. And in that moment, I had been too stunned, too unsure of myself to do anything. I had been manipulated not just in that instant, but for months, maybe even years. Ashley had been there, her camera recording, her eyes cold and calculating. They had been preparing for this, building their narrative piece by piece, and I had been none the wiser. That night, after the shock of the dinner had worn off, I knew I had to act fast. The sense of helplessness that had settled over me earlier began to turn into something fiercer: anger, determination, a need to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I picked up my phone and texted my lawyer. I needed answers. I needed to know how to undo the damage I had allowed to happen. It wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about my very autonomy. My son had taken it upon himself to decide my future, and I had done nothing to stop him. The reply from my lawyer came quickly, a sharp contrast to the hollow, empty feeling in my chest. If you didn't revoke it, Mary, it's still valid. He still has access to make decisions on your behalf if you are deemed medically incapable. Her words cut through me like glass. I could almost hear the warning in her voice, the understanding that things were about to escalate. The situation was no longer just about my apartment. It was about control, and Daniel had been holding the reins for far too long. I felt the anger rise in my throat like a bitter taste. I had trusted him. I had trusted them both. They were my family, my flesh and blood. And they had used me, manipulated me, all while pretending to be supportive, pretending to be loving. But the love was never there. It was a facade, a performance, a carefully constructed story that they were telling the world. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a resource, something to be used, something to be controlled. And now, it was time for me to fight back. The next morning, I dressed with purpose. I wasn't the same woman I had been the day before. That woman had been meek, unsure, afraid to make waves. But today I was someone else entirely. I was a woman who had been betrayed by the very people she had loved and nurtured, and now I was taking control of my life again. I grabbed all the documents I could find: old bank statements, deeds, legal papers, everything that might give me a foothold in the battle that was about to come. I brought them all to my lawyer's office, where we went through them together. She was sharp, efficient, flipping through the papers with a kind of focused energy that I admired, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt creep in. How had I let this happen? How had I let my son, my only child, get so far into my life without ever questioning his motives? We went over everything, and I could see the grim realization on her face as she read the power of attorney document. "You never revoked this," she said, her voice low. "Technically, he still has access to your financial decisions, Mary, even if you're in a sound state of mind." The words hung in the air, suffocating heavy with the reality of what I was facing. I felt sick to my stomach. I had never imagined that I would be here in this position, having to fight for control over my own life. But as the lawyer went through the steps we needed to take to revoke Daniel's power of attorney, I realized something. I had to reclaim my life, even if it meant going against my son, even if it meant going against everything I had ever believed about family. This wasn't just about the apartment, it was about my right to make my own decisions, to live my life on my terms. The process wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. It felt like I was unearthing a buried treasure that had long been forgotten, only to find that the treasure was no longer something beautiful. It was something that needed to be torn down, rebuilt, and reclaimed. And so I began the process of revoking his access. I removed him from my emergency contacts. I froze my credit. I changed my passwords. I began documenting every interaction with him, every text, every conversation, just in case. I needed to be prepared. This wasn't just a matter of securing my finances, it was about securing my mind, my life, my dignity. The anger I felt was like a fire that burned hotter with every step I took to regain control. They had underestimated me. They thought I was weak. But now I saw things clearly. I wasn't going to let my son and his wife steal what was rightfully mine. They had taken enough from me, and I was done letting them have any more. It was time to fight back. It was time to take control of my own story. The weight of what had happened was still settling in like the lingering taste of something bitter that refused to fade. But in the silence of my apartment, I made a decision. It wasn't an easy one. It wasn't one I ever thought I'd have to make. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I couldn't sit back anymore, not when everything I had worked for, everything I had built was slipping away. It wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about my life, my future, and my right to make decisions for myself. Daniel and Ashley had crossed a line, and it was time for me to draw my own. I stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the remnants of a life I had once taken for granted. The photos on the walls, the old furniture, the memories, everything seemed so distant now, as if I were standing in someone else's home. I had to let go of all the memories I had held onto for so long. I had to stop thinking of my apartment as a sanctuary and start seeing it for what it was, a battleground. I had to leave. I didn't know where I would go, but I knew that I couldn't stay here. Not with them looming over me, thinking they could just take whatever they wanted. The thought of Daniel and Ashley moving into this space, making it theirs, pretending that I had agreed to all of this, was more than I could bear. Every inch of this place had been touched by my past, by my life with my late husband. And now they wanted to erase all of that. They had no idea what they were taking, and it hurt. It hurt deeply. I grabbed my phone and texted my lawyer again. I didn't know what to expect, but I needed to know what my options were. The law was a maze, and I was too tired of being lost in it. When the reply came, it was clear. I had to act quickly. I couldn't allow them to continue with this false narrative, this sense of entitlement. It wasn't just about stopping them from taking my home. It was about showing them that they couldn't control me, that they couldn't dictate my future. I had to protect myself, and the only way to do that was to make a clean break. The decision wasn't made in a rush. It wasn't a decision made in anger or frustration, although both of those things burned within me. It was a decision that came from a place of clarity, from understanding that I had been a part of my own downfall. I had let this happen. I had allowed them to walk all over me to believe they could take what wasn't theirs to take. But that was over now. I couldn't keep being the person who let others dictate the terms of her life. I called my lawyer and arranged a meeting. I needed to get everything in order. My assets, my finances, my wills. I needed to make sure that if Daniel and Ashley tried to move forward with their plans, they wouldn't be able to touch anything that was mine. The lawyer was efficient, calm, and sharp. She didn't waste any time guiding me through the necessary steps to protect myself. I had to revoke the power of attorney immediately. I had to move my money, my belongings, everything out of reach. The more we went through the process, the more I felt the weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick, but it felt like the right thing to do. As I sat in the lawyer's office, surrounded by papers and forms, something shifted inside me. I was no longer just a woman trying to hold on to a piece of her past. I was a woman reclaiming her future. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. I was ready to fight for myself. I had no choice but to be strong, to stand firm in my resolve, no matter how difficult it would be. By the time I left the office, I knew what I had to do next. I had to leave. I had to go somewhere where I could start over, where I could find peace again. I wasn't sure where I would go yet, but I didn't need to know that immediately. I had already made the hardest choice. I was done being passive. I was done being controlled. I was going to take back what was mine. The process wasn't simple. There were phone calls to make arrangements to set up. I had to find a place somewhere far enough away that I could truly escape from the life Daniel and Ashley had tried to impose on me. I didn't want to just move to a new apartment or buy another house in the same city. I needed to leave to get far enough away so that I could rebuild my life without their constant presence hanging over me. It was a long shot, but I started looking at properties, searching for something small, something simple. A cabin, a place by the water somewhere that would give me space to breathe again. I began the process of clearing out my apartment. Every box I packed, every piece of furniture I moved, was a small act of defiance. With every step, I felt the anger and frustration I had been holding in for so long begin to dissipate, replaced by something else, something stronger. It was the feeling of reclaiming my life, of making a choice that was entirely mine. I wasn't doing this for anyone else. I wasn't doing this because I had to. I was doing it because I had to protect myself, because I refused to let anyone control my story any longer. By the time the moving truck arrived, I had already made arrangements for a place 2 states away, a small cabin on a lake away from everything and everyone. It was far from perfect. The kitchen was outdated, the patio cracked and uneven. But it didn't matter. It was mine. It would be mine, and no one could take that from me. As I locked the door behind me one final time, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I was leaving the past behind, yes, but I was also starting something new. I was taking the first step in reclaiming my life, and that decision, no matter how difficult, felt like the most important one I had ever made. The drive to my new home felt surreal, as though I was caught between two worlds. The old world, the one I was leaving behind, and the new one that was unfolding before me. The road stretched on, winding through unfamiliar countryside, and I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. The apartment, the life I had known for so long, was behind me, now a memory I couldn't shake, but had to leave behind. I had made the decision to walk away from it, to step into a future that I could shape on my own terms. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, a step I never imagined I would take. But in that moment, I knew it was the only choice I could make. When I arrived at the cabin, a wave of relief washed over me. The place was small, simpler than I had ever imagined for myself, but it felt right. It was quiet here. The air was different, fresh, like I could finally breathe deeply again. The city, the noise, the ever-present weight of expectation, it all seemed so far away now. The house, though small, felt like a refuge. It was not just a physical space. It was a blank canvas, a place where I could start over, a place where I could rebuild who I was without the constant interference of others. I could breathe here. I could think clearly again. As I unpacked the few belongings I had brought with me, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. There was nothing extravagant about the cabin. It didn't have the luxury of my old apartment, the years of memories, or the comfortable furniture I had carefully chosen. But none of that mattered. It wasn't about the things I had. It was about the freedom I had fought so hard to regain. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The air was cleaner here, but it wasn't just the physical space. It was the mental and emotional space I had been suffocating in for so long. No more pressure to conform to others' expectations, no more manipulation, no more feeling like I was being erased. Here I was allowed to exist for myself. The first few days were difficult, no doubt. The quiet, though peaceful, was also unnerving. There were moments when the silence felt like a weight, when the emptiness of the cabin reminded me of the family I had left behind, the relationships that had unraveled. I missed the laughter of family gatherings, the comfort of having people around. But there was a different kind of comfort in being alone here. I could finally hear my own thoughts, make my own decisions without fear of someone else stepping in, without feeling like my choices were being dictated by others. As the days passed, I started to explore the area, taking walks by the lake, breathing in the crisp air, watching the way the water moved gently with the wind. It was a kind of therapy that I hadn't realized I needed. The simplicity of the surroundings, the quiet rhythm of life here, it was soothing. Each step away from my old life felt like a step toward healing, toward becoming the person I had lost somewhere along the way. I started gardening, planting flowers and herbs along the side of the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was mine, something I could nurture and watch grow. It was a reminder that life could still bloom, even in the midst of pain and loss. I found joy in the small things, the sound of the wind through the trees, the first rays of sunshine hitting the front porch in the morning, the taste of fresh herbs in my cooking. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel rushed. There was no deadline, no expectation to meet. It was just me, the open sky, and a future that for once felt entirely in my hands. But even in this new place, the ghosts of the past sometimes crept in. The texts from Daniel and Ashley continued to flood my phone. Their voices, filled with demands, apologies, manipulations, still lingered in the background of my thoughts. I had expected that. I knew that walking away wouldn't make everything disappear. But now in this quiet space, I felt stronger. I wasn't running from them. I was simply putting distance between their influence and me. I had given them so much power for so long, but now for the first time I was reclaiming my own. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was empowering. It was a sign that I was learning to be at peace with myself, to trust myself again. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea watching the sunset over the lake, I felt a sense of peace that I had not known in years. There was no one here to judge me, no one to make decisions for me. It was just me and the world, and I was learning how to find contentment in that. I knew there was more to come. There would be challenges ahead, moments when I would question my choices, moments when the past would try to pull me back in. But in this moment, with the wind gently moving through the trees and the warm light of the setting sun wrapping around me, I knew I had made the right choice. I had created a new beginning for myself, one that was built on the foundations of strength, independence, and self-worth. I had escaped the constraints of the life I had known, and now I was free. I was free to live on my own terms, and that was a gift I would never take for granted again. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, I smiled. It wasn't an easy journey to get here, but it had been worth every step. In this new beginning, I found myself again stronger, freer, and ready for whatever the future might hold. It was inevitable. I had known deep down that they would come looking for me. After all, they didn't understand why I had left, why I had made the choices I had. Daniel and Ashley couldn't grasp that I was no longer their pawn to move at their whim, no longer someone they could manipulate and control. They didn't see it as I did. This wasn't just about an apartment or a family dynamic. This was about power, about reclaiming my life, and they were determined to take back what they thought was theirs. It happened one evening just a few days after I had settled into the cabin. The soft evening light was fading into a deep blue, and I was sitting on the porch enjoying the quiet when I heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up. The gravel crunched beneath tires as the vehicle came to a stop and my stomach tightened. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I had been expecting this. Daniel, Ashley. They had followed me here. I stood up, my feet moving on their own, taking me toward the door. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think clearly enough to make a decision. It was like I was on autopilot, my body moving in the same direction it had been trained to move for so many years, toward the conflict, toward the confrontation that I had been avoiding, but knew was coming. The doorbell rang sharp and insistent. I opened it slowly, deliberately, trying to calm my racing heart. And there they stood, Daniel with his typical smile that never quite reached his eyes, and Ashley with that unnerving look of feigned sweetness, as though everything was perfectly normal. Their eyes shifted quickly, taking in the modest cabin, the sparse furniture, the simple life I had chosen for myself. I saw the judgment in their gazes, the way they were sizing up this new life I had built. "Mom, we need to talk." Daniel said, his tone too casual, as if he was still in control, still the one who called the shots. There was no apology in his voice, no understanding of the hurt he had caused. Just a demand. The same tone he had used when he had announced their plans for the apartment. The same tone that made my stomach turn with its sense of entitlement. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how. My heart was beating in my throat, but I stood there watching them, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. They hadn't come here to listen, to understand, to offer reconciliation. They had come here to reclaim what they felt was rightfully theirs, and I was no longer willing to give it to them. "We've been worried about you," Ashley said, stepping forward with that fake concern in her voice. "You've been distant, and we just want to make sure you're okay." But the words felt hollow, empty, like a script they had rehearsed before showing up on my doorstep. I could hear the underlying accusation in her voice. I could see the way she was trying to paint me as unreasonable as the one who had caused this rift, as if I were the one who had taken something from them. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I could feel my hands shaking, but I folded them together to steady myself. I wasn't going to let them see the fear. Not now. Not when I had come this far. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice rising slightly, no longer trying to hide the frustration beneath his calm exterior. "This isn't you. You can't just shut us out like this. We're your family. You have to understand this is about the future. You can't keep holding on to the past." His words hit me like a slap. The future. What about my future? What about my right to choose how I lived, where I lived? His words weren't about family, they were about control. He didn't want to understand me or my choices. He just wanted me to fall back into line, to submit, to let him dictate the terms of my life once again. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I had fought too hard to get here, to this moment, this space where I could finally breathe without the weight of their expectations crushing me. "I'm not holding on to the past," I said, my voice firm now, steady. "I'm letting go of it. And I'm not going to let you or anyone else decide what's best for me anymore." The words seemed to hang in the air between us, a challenge and assertion of my own autonomy that they couldn't ignore. I saw the flicker of confusion in Daniel's eyes, the brief hesitation. But then his expression hardened. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to acknowledge that I was standing up for myself. He wanted me to shrink back, to give in. "You don't understand," he said, his voice colder now, the mask of civility slipping. "You're being unreasonable. You're acting like this is all some kind of game. You're making it harder than it needs to be." His words stung, but I refused to let them break me. He had always known how to manipulate me, how to make me feel guilty, how to make me question my decisions. But not anymore. I had seen through it, and I wasn't going to let him rewrite the narrative. Maybe I am making it harder, I said, my voice softening, but no less firm. But it's not because I want to make your life difficult. It's because I'm trying to live my own life finally. And that's something you've never understood. Ashley's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight smile that was anything but kind. So this is it? You're just gonna cut us off like we don't matter? She asked, her tone dripping with mock disbelief. But I could see the cracks in her facade, the way her anger was bubbling just beneath the surface. She wasn't concerned about me. She was concerned about losing control, losing her grip on what she thought she was entitled to. I didn't answer her. I didn't have to. My silence was enough. Daniel let out a sharp sigh, clearly frustrated. You're making a mistake, Mom. You'll regret this. He turned and started walking back toward the car, his footsteps heavy with frustration, with the unspoken words he couldn't bring himself to say. As they drove away, I stood there on the porch watching them leave, watching the car disappear down the road. The confrontation was over, but the truth remained. I wasn't the one who had made a mistake. I had made the choice to protect myself, to protect my peace, and no one, not even my own son, would take that from me. The silence that followed felt like a victory. It was mine, all mine, and no one could take it away. Days passed, and I thought I had found peace in the quiet rhythm of my new life. The cabin, with its simplicity and solitude, had become my sanctuary. I had started to rebuild myself piece by piece, finding comfort in the small, everyday tasks that gave me purpose. But the silence, as I had learned, was never permanent. The phone calls had stopped, but the texts hadn't. Each time my phone buzzed, I braced myself, knowing it would be one of them, either Daniel or Ashley, or both demanding answers, questioning my choices, trying to force me back into the life they had planned for me. I had come to expect their attempts to manipulate me, but I never imagined they would escalate in the way they did. One afternoon, as I sat by the window sipping a cup of tea and watching the sun filter through the trees, I saw the email notification pop up on my phone. It was from Daniel. My stomach tightened as I opened it, already knowing what it would be. The subject line read, "Final Settlement Agreement." I felt my heart sink as I opened the email. The words were calculated cold. Daniel's message was businesslike, impersonal, as though he were writing to a stranger. He didn't refer to me as his mother. There were no words of concern or even acknowledgement of the hurt he had caused. Instead, there was an attachment, a legal document. The first line of the email read, "If you want to avoid court, sign the attached agreement, and we will forget all of this." My mind raced as I downloaded the file. The document opened with a series of terms, most of which were foreign to me, filled with legal jargon I could barely understand. But there was one thing I did understand clearly: the transfer of deed agreement. They were asking me to sign over the ownership of my apartment, my home, to them. This wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was a clear attempt to solidify their claim on what they had no right to take. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. They had moved quickly, had already taken the next step in their plan, assuming that I would bend under pressure, that I would give in to their demands just as I always had before. They had no idea how much I had changed. They still saw me as the same woman they could control, the same woman who had once allowed them to dictate her life. But I wasn't that woman anymore. And they were about to learn that. My mind was flooded with anger, but there was also a deep sense of sadness. This was my son, the person I had raised, the person I had loved and supported all his life. And yet here he was, treating me like an obstacle to be overcome, a hurdle to be cleared. I couldn't wrap my head around how this had happened, how my child had become someone who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. I sat there staring at the document, knowing that if I signed it, I would be giving up everything. Not just the apartment, but my dignity, my autonomy, my right to live my life on my own terms. It felt like a betrayal, not just from him, but from the very life I had tried to build for us. All these years of sacrifice, all these years of love and care had been reduced to a transaction. And the worst part was, I had allowed it to happen. I had let them manipulate me into this position. But now in this moment, I made a choice. I would not give them what they wanted. I would not let them win. With trembling hands, I forwarded the document to my lawyer, my heart heavy with the knowledge that the battle was not over, that it was about to escalate in ways I couldn't predict. I had already made my decision, but now it was time to take action. The phone call came an hour later, a voice on the other end that I hadn't heard in days. Daniel. I could hear the tension in his voice, the way he was trying to sound calm, collected. "Mom, He said, I saw that you didn't sign the agreement. You don't want to do this. We're trying to move on to make things right, but you're making it impossible. The words cut through me, but I didn't let them break me. No, Daniel, I replied, my voice steady. This isn't about making things right. This is about control. And I'm done letting you control me. There was a long silence on the other end, and I could feel the shift in his tone. You don't understand, he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. This is for everyone, for the family. We just want what's best for you. No, I said firmly. What's best for me is to live my life on my own terms without interference, without manipulation. I'm not signing anything, and I'm not going to let you or Ashley pressure me into it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear his breathing on the other end, and for the first time I didn't care. I had said my piece. I had made my stand, and I wasn't going to let him change my mind. You'll regret this, he said, the words heavy with finality. I won't, I replied and hung up the phone. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the decision I had made began to settle in. I had just drawn a line in the sand, one that I knew would be hard to hold. The legal battle was coming, and I would have to fight for everything I had worked for. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't the woman who had let her son take control of her life. I was the woman who had fought for her own freedom, her own peace, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me. The next morning, I took the first step towards securing my future. I called my lawyer, prepared for the legal battle ahead, but more importantly, I prepared myself for the road I had chosen. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be mine. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt sure of where I was headed. I was done being controlled. I was done being the victim of someone else's story. From now on, I was going to write my own. The days that followed the confrontation were long, each one marked by the weight of uncertainty. The legal battle loomed in the distance, a reminder that I was still tangled in a web of choices that weren't just mine to make anymore. It was a fight I hadn't asked for, a battle that felt like it was being waged not just for material things, but for the right to exist as my own person. The apartment, the will, the documents, those were all just symbols, representations of something deeper, something far more personal. They were about control, autonomy, and the stripping away of my sense of self. But what I realized as the days unfolded was that this fight wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming something far more precious than any asset or piece of property. It was about my right to live freely on my own terms. It was about the lesson that I had been too afraid to learn for far too long. The lesson that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stand up for yourself, especially when it feels like everyone around you is telling you that your worth is measured by what you give to them. I had spent so many years trying to please everyone, trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect daughter, that I had lost sight of who I was. I had allowed myself to be defined by the roles I played in other people's lives, rather than by my own desires, my own needs, my own dreams. In the process, I had forgotten that my life belonged to me. I had forgotten that it was okay to say no, that it was okay to put myself first, even when it felt like I was disappointing everyone around me. It wasn't easy, this newfound understanding of self-worth. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I questioned whether I had made the right decision. Had I been too harsh with Daniel? Had I overreacted? Was there a way to repair the relationship with him, with Ashley? I would be lying if I said the questions didn't haunt me, if I didn't feel the sting of the love I had once shared with them, the connection that now seemed frayed beyond repair. But every time those doubts surfaced, I reminded myself of why I had done what I did. I had fought for my right to live authentically. And sometimes living authentically means making choices that are painful, choices that others won't understand. The lesson I had learned, though it had taken years of compromise, silence, and pain to fully grasp, was simple. I was enough just as I was. I didn't need anyone's validation to be worthy of respect or love. I didn't need to give away my power to keep others happy. And most importantly, I didn't have to keep sacrificing my own peace to maintain relationships that drained me of who I was. The emotional weight of that realization wasn't something that would lift overnight. It was something that would take time to internalize, to fully understand and accept. But it was the beginning of something new, a new way of being that I hadn't known before. I had spent so long carrying the burden of others' expectations, trying to meet their needs, that I had forgotten what it meant to meet my own. As the weeks went by, I found myself reconnecting with things I had lost touch with. Quiet mornings spent in the garden, afternoons reading books that had sat on shelves for years, evenings spent watching the sun set over the lake, with nothing but my own thoughts to keep me company. These simple pleasures became more meaningful than I had ever realized. In their quiet simplicity, I found peace. I found joy in just being and existing without the weight of other people's demands or opinions. But even more than that, I found strength. Strength in my decision to walk away from the life I had known, strength in the courage to stand firm in my convictions, even when it felt like the world was pushing back. And with that strength came clarity. The clarity that I didn't need to explain myself anymore. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for the choices I made. I had the right to choose my own path, and if that path meant leaving behind people who didn't respect my boundaries or my voice, then so be it. The hardest part of all this was realizing that despite all the love I had given, despite the years of sacrifice, some people would never understand my choices. They would never see why I had to take this step. But that wasn't my problem anymore. It was theirs. And that too was a lesson. Sometimes you have to let people go, not because you don't love them, but because you love yourself enough to let go of the weight they place on you. As the days turned into weeks, I began to heal. Not all at once, but slowly, steadily. I stopped waiting for the phone calls, stopped checking my email with a sense of dread. I stopped second-guessing myself, stopped worrying about what they might think. I started living for myself, and in doing so, I started living with peace. And in that peace, I found the greatest lesson of all: I am enough. I always have been. And that is a truth no one, not even my own flesh and blood, can take away.